Good evening and welcome to My Jewish Learning and the last in our series of programs on resilience and recovery and hope. If you've been with us through previous installments, you know that we've talked to doctors and novelists, neurologists, and therapists, and all with the idea of how do we relate to very difficult times, headlines that rush at us, even in the last hour, that are incredibly difficult. To help us navigate this crazy world that we're in, we are joined tonight for our last of the programs by Rabbi Shai Held, who is maybe no one more equipped to talk us through the present moment. Um, Shai, of course, is the president and dean of the Hadar Institute in New York. He's the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, and most recently, a book I love, a modern classic, Judaism is About Love, which is a message I think a lot of us can learn to hear now more than ever. Our program is brought to you both by My Jewish Learning and with the help of the UJA-Federation of New York, partners in much of what we do. And I just also want to thank both Beryl Bessemer and Thea Wieseltier for their help in putting together this program and making the conversation easy. Shai is going to speak for, let's say, a half an hour or more, and then I'll come back and we'll have a little chat. And I also encourage you, if you have questions for Rabbi Held, please put them in the chat, not in the Q&A, in the chat. So without further ado, I want to welcome my friend and a great thinker, Rabbi Shai Held.
Thank you so much, Andy. Good evening, everyone. It is another difficult evening in our country, but nevertheless, I want to wish everyone a good evening. Thank you all so much for making the time to do a little bit of thinking with me about hope. It wasn't so long ago that many Americans were swept up in the vision articulated by a presidential candidate who spoke about the audacity of hope. And yet now, not that many years later, we find ourselves in a moment of pervasive hopelessness and even despair. Impressionistically, I'd say from my travels around the country that this seems to be true of people on every point on the political spectrum. Sometimes things seem so bleak that we think that what we might need is not hope, but simply resilience. So in theory, I could be speaking about that. But I want to reach, if I could, for something more ambitious, something that my sense is that most, if not all of us, are longing for, which is the more robust notion of hope. And I want to begin with two poignant and powerful scenes from Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, that are perhaps surprisingly, I think, remarkable windows into a specifically Jewish approach to hope. So first, Sefer Bimidbar, the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is in many ways a profoundly tragic book. What starts out as a story of a triumphant march toward the promised land becomes something else entirely. It becomes a dreadful tale of distrust, disloyalty, disappointment, and ultimately, as we'll hear, of death. It's worth paying careful attention, though, to the structure of Bimidbar. In the first 10 chapters, everything goes exactly according to God's plan. Whatever God commands, the people dutifully obey. As one Bible scholar puts it, this is a quote, in these chapters, a somewhat idealistic picture emerges, a community ordered in all ways appropriate to God's dwelling in the center of the camp. The human implementation of the divine command precisely is observed throughout. One is given to wonder how anything could go wrong. That is, close quote. Yet, everything does seem to go wrong. After all the meticulously executed preparations, the people are finally ready to move forward. The dream of life in the promised land appears finally within reach. And then, in one instant, it all falls apart. As chapter 11 of Bamidbar opens, we hear, Vayehi ha'am kimitonenim ra be'oznei Hashem. The people took to complaining bitterly before the Lord. I won't rehearse the details of what follows. We'll suffice it to say that conflicts emerge between the people and God, between the people and their leaders, and between the leaders themselves. The Bible scholar Terry Fredheim assesses the scene this way. As Bamidbar unfolds, quote, obedience to God's command turns to rebellion. Trust becomes mistrust. The holy is profaned. Order becomes disorder. The future of the people of God is threatened. Reading the opening of Bamidbar, we had expected something very different, something far better. What we witness as readers is nothing less than the seeming dissolution and disintegration of God's dreams for Israel. One of the tragedies that animates the book of Numbers is that the people can't seem to shake their affinity for false gods. Recall, in one of the most painful moments in the Torah, even as Moses communes with God on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai, the people below begin worshiping the golden calf. Now, for a minute, think about how much has happened since then. The Mishkan or tabernacle has been erected and the appurtenances it needs have been prepared. The order of sacrifices has been put into place. The camp and the people within the camp have been prepared for the journey. God's presence has been made manifest, ready to lead the way. And yet, despite all this, things deteriorate to such an extent that the people return to where they began, worshiping an idol, this time Baal Peor. That's Numbers 25. 59 chapters of the Torah have passed since the golden calf episode, yet it seems that the people have not grown at all. Baal Peor is like the golden calf redux. And in the wake of this awful moment of unfaithfulness, the last of the generation liberated from Egypt die in a terrible plague. The older generation, at least, will not inherit the land. All of this, by the way, separate from what you could argue is the great tragedy of the book of Numbers, the tragic story of the spies. Now, some of you may already be asking, I came to a talk about hope, and I'm hearing someone talk about the book of Numbers. What is actually going on here? Well, I think it's important in talking about and thinking about a Jewish approach to hope to think about a story of profound hopelessness. Because, as we are about to see, Bamidbar, Numbers, is at one and the same time willing to stare straight into the abyss and unwilling to give it the final word. And that, I think, is a profound window into Jewish approaches to despair. Staring into the abyss, but refusing to give it the final word. What we've seen so far is obviously a very dark tale. God tried to breathe new life into this people, and it did not work. Had Bamidbar ended there, we would be faced with a story of unmitigated, irredeemable tragedy. We would be confronted with a story that is about the death of hope. Crucially, though, Bamidbar does not end there, and the crisis in the covenant is not the end of the story. After this second collapse into idolatry, when the last remaining members of the older generation have died out, something really interesting happens. Bamidbar launches into a census of the new generation, the people who will, despite everything, inherit the land. And in stark contrast to what has happened until now, in the last 11 chapters of the book, we encounter no death, no murmurings, no rebellions against the leadership, none of it. Something genuinely new seems to have emerged. Just when all hope seems to be gone, fresh seeds of hope seem to emerge. And what I want to suggest is that there is something deeply and wonderfully Jewish about all this. Human stubbornness and sinfulness take an enormous toll on the people themselves, on their leaders, and even ultimately on God. And yet the Torah will not give these human failings the last word. it is crucial to note that Bamidbar does not paper over the horror. Things really have gone terribly, almost unimaginably wrong. And so that leads us to a crucial lesson. Hope is not ever a function of lying to ourselves about how dark things are. Or, if I can put it a little differently, hope comes after grief, not instead of it. Hope comes after grief and not instead of it. I won't go into this tonight, but I think that is key to the whole prophetic worldview as well. In this wonderfully quintessentially Jewish story, despair is simply not allowed to have the final word. Just will not, the Torah will not allow it. Now, let's turn to the second biblical story, the very end of Melachim Bet, 2 Kings. As the book of Kings draws to an end, King Josiah, Yoshiyahu, God's faithful reformer, dies. And with him, it seems, all hopes of recovery and renewal for the people died too. The book narrates nothing less than the dissolution of the kingdom of Judah. Ultimately, as you know, in 586 BCE, Jerusalem is destroyed. 4 kings ruled during this final period, and all of them, the narrator tells us, quote, did evil in the sight of the Lord. All of this culminates, it seems like, in 4 words near the end of the book. Vayagel Yehuda me'al admato. Thus Judah was exiled from its land. Reading these closing chapters of Kings, you get the impression that God has washed God's hands of the Davidic kings. And then, in a totally surprising epilogue, something strange and totally unexpected happens. King Yehoiachin is released from prison where he has been held for decades. He is still in exile in Babylon, yet, as we'll hear in just a moment, he is treated well. And we as readers are left to wonder whether the Davidic kings have been completely abandoned after all. Listen for a moment to how the book of Kings actually concludes, and I'll read this in English in the interest of time. In the 37th year of the king Yehoiachin of Judah, on the 27th day of the 12th month, King Evil-Merodach of Babylon, you can bracket all that for a moment, in the year he became king, took note of the king Yehoiachin of Judah and released him from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a throne above those of other kings who were with him in Babylon. His prison garments were removed, and Yehoiachin received regular rations by his favor for the rest of his life. A regular allotment of food was given to him at the king's behest, an allotment for each day, all of the days of his life. And now the book ends. Scholars have long debated, really fought, over how to interpret these concluding verses. Some think this is much ado about nothing, right? The closing report on Yehoiachin is presented, they would say, as a simple fact. It doesn't herald anything. Yet others see something subtle but highly significant here, and I think important for us as well. Listen to one prominent contemporary Bible scholar for a moment on these verses. I'm going to quote this because I think it's worth listening. Alongside the story of God's inevitable judgment because of human disobedience is a hint that the last word has not yet been spoken. The final word is an unexpected account of liberation, however tentative. After 37 years in exile, there is the inexplicable good news of freedom for Yehoiachin. Though God is not mentioned in the closing words of Kings, one is invited to ponder if the reality of liberation and favor amid exile is not, finally, also a sign of divine grace. The tentative ending suggests an incomplete story that will be continued another time. Here again, as in the book of Bamidbar, we come upon a situation in which all hope seems to be gone, when the future seems so bleak that it is no future at all, and then, just as we are ready to succumb to despair and declare the story over, something happens. A narrator appears and says, "Not so fast." hope is reborn. In this instance, it's a tenuous hope, a shadow of a glimmer of a possibility, but it is nevertheless hope. The Bible, in other words, time and again refuses to end in total darkness, to surrender to the abyss. If I may be so bold, surrendering to the abyss is just not what Jews do. Now, I would like to notice a striking difference between these two biblical tales I've shared, between Bamidbar and Melachim, that is. In the one case, it seems like the people are responsible for the change and are therefore the agents of hope. In the other, though this is not made explicit, it seems that God is responsible for the change and is therefore the agent of hope. More concretely, in Bamidbar, it seems like the second generation somehow manages to be different, more faithful, less rebellious. But in Melachim and Kings, it is God who, because of God's grace and God's enduring commitment to the people, plants the seeds of new hope and possibility. Keeping that distinction in mind, I want to invite you to notice or be aware of one of the most interesting debates in medieval Jewish thought. It's the debate over who will bring the Messiah. Everyone agrees that in the much longed for Messianic age, the status quo will have been overturned and the world will look very different from the way it looks today. But there are at least two big questions about which Jewish thinkers vehemently differ, often dramatically. Number one, in what ways will the world be different? And number two, who will effect the changes that will bring about this changed world? I won't pretend to do justice to a complex discussion among great thinkers. Instead, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of key themes and contrasts that I think are interestingly resonant to our own situations as Jews in a time that seems hopeless. So first, in what ways will the world be different? According to Nachmanides or Ramban, the short answer is in every way. In his commentary to Deuteronomy, Ramban assures us that one day, after God finally circumcises our hearts, now I'm going to quote from him for a second, choosing the good will be part of human nature. The heart will not desire that which is improper, end quote. To put it simply, the Yetzer Hara, or evil inclination, will have been defeated and even eliminated. Messianism, in other words, means new human beings with a new nature, or if you prefer, a renewed nature, nature as it was before Adam went astray. On the other hand, we hear the sober voice of Maimonides, for whom the world will be different in only very limited ways. Quote, let no one think that in the days of the Messiah, any of the laws of nature will be set aside. The world will follow its natural course. Human nature is what it is, and it will not change. What will change is the political domain. Maimonides quotes a well-known rabbinic dictum: the sole difference between the present and the time of the Messiah is delivery from the servitude to foreign powers. The Jewish people will be sovereign and able to worship their God. That and that alone is how the Messianic age unfolds. In other words, unlike Ramban, Nachmanides, Maimonides wants to remind us that the Messianic age will not bring the world as we know it to an end. Or if I can put this in my own very crude terms, this is me talking. In the Messianic future, the lion may lie down with the lamb, but if so, the lamb will be eaten. Right? There is no transformation of the nature of reality as we know it. Now, the answers to the second question, who will effect the change, is clear, or should be, from the answer to the first. The kind of radical change envisioned by Nachmanides can only be effected by God. The much more limited change imagined by Maimonides can and will be effected by us. Now, why all of this in this moment when we struggle for hope? For Nachmanides, The ultimate hope lies in God's future intervention, which will transform nature itself, including human nature, and open up a new, previously unimaginable future. For Maimonides, on the other hand, hope lies with us. For Maimonides, what is central is human freedom and human responsibility. The Messianic age will be ushered in by human beings, not by God. But here's the question I want to pose. Which one of these visions is actually more hopeful? Some thinkers love Maimonides' approach because it strikes them as inducing hope. If we will it, we can do it. Yet on the other hand, if you know anything at all about human beings and our nature, if you have studied human history in even the most cursory way, it seems hard to imagine that we are capable of what Maimonides imagines. Will we really ever redeem ourselves? And so other thinkers gravitate towards Ramban. God is omnipotent and true to God's promises. Human beings, on the other hand, are not the best investment. But the problem is, if you are attentive to how the world seems to work, maybe always has worked, but surely works now, the idea of a miraculous intervention and transformation seems to many of us somewhere between far-fetched and impossible to imagine. From my perspective, this is the dilemma. One might even want to say the tragic predicament of religious belief in redemption. Belief in human potential for total transformation a la Maimonides seems naive. Too much faith in people. But so too does waiting for a final divine redemption a la Nachmanides. Too much faith in a kind of divine intervention many of us have grown skeptical of. And so our hope somehow needs to be more modest and maybe even more tenuous than what either of them suggest. Let me pause for a moment and share one thought that I personally find very helpful in navigating these times. The thought is simply this: hope should never be confused for optimism, or if you prefer, optimism should not be confused for hope. Although some philosophers equate, or perhaps I would want to say conflate, hope and optimism, I think this is a very big mistake. To put it simply, hope is a virtue, whereas optimism is merely a temperament. A temperament is not a virtue. If anything, this is something that the literary critic Terry Eagleton has written about very compellingly, hope and optimism can actually be opposites, because optimism, as Eagleton puts it, can be a form of moral evasion, right? It doesn't take despair seriously enough. Very often, optimists are optimistic in part because they refuse to acknowledge the depth of the crisis that we are in. Perhaps counterintuitively, thinkers like Eagleton tell us that optimism is actually the enemy of hope, which is necessary precisely because one is able to confess how grave a situation is. This is echoing, I think, what I've talked about already about grief coming before hope. So, what is hope? I want to borrow the philosopher Paul Ricoeur's wonderful phrase: hope is a passion for the possible. It is a movement toward the good, to quote Eagleton, not merely a craving for it. And I would want to say, I won't go into this at length now, that one of the differences between hope and optimism is that hope, at least some of the time, requires action. As I say, optimism is a temperament or even a mood. Hope is a commitment. So for what it's worth, if you ask me for my assessment of America's future, I would say I am decidedly not optimistic, but I do have hope. Now, I want to turn quickly to two more traditional images that might help us think about hope, or better, help us maintain it and sustain it in these really hard times. There is a midrash that I confess to being somewhat obsessed with because it both confounds me and takes my breath away every time I think about it. Deuteronomy describes God as El Emunah, which in biblical Hebrew means a God who is faithful. But the sages choose to interpret the phrase differently and understand it to mean not that God is faithful, but that God has faith. Listen to Midrash Sifrei, El Emunah she'emin ba'olam uvira'o. A God who has faith, God believed in the world and therefore created it. In the conclusion of my most recent book, Judaism is About Love, I comment on this midrash, and since I had a lot of time to get the words just right before publishing it, I will do the gross thing for a minute and quote 2 paragraphs from there. Quote myself. I know that's kind of gross, but sometimes the words of this midrash strike me as hopelessly naive. If God has faith in this world, then God must not be paying attention. Or perhaps we should take the past tense seriously. God had faith in the past when God created the world, but by now God has undoubtedly seen enough to know better. But at other times, I find these words tremendously moving. God knows who we are, knows of the cruelty and the callousness of which we are capable, knows how trapped many of us are within the prisons of our own egos, knows how far we often stray from the divine ideals of love and compassion and the pursuit of justice. And yet, in the face of all that, God believes in us. God believes in our capacity for decency and for love and for goodness and for justice. God actively implants these capacities within us, so God knows that we are capable of them. To be sure, we are capable of other things too, like hatred and brutality and indifference to the suffering of others. And even, I think we need to learn to admit, of reveling in the suffering we cause to others. I hear the midrash about God believing in the world and creating it as suggesting that God has faith in our capacity for goodness, and even that God has faith that we will, at least some of the time, manifest and express that goodness. End of quote. Here's the thing about the biblical God. The God of Israel is consistently disappointed. I've often said that if we needed to give the Bible a more contemporary sounding title, we might plausibly choose the Book of Divine Disappointment. And that leads to the second thing about the biblical God. The God of Israel never gives up. That is the heart of biblical theology as I understand it. The God of Israel is consistently disappointed, but refuses to give up. And part of what makes the God of the Bible so relatable is that if you read the pages of Tanakh, you encounter a God who finds heartbreak and disappointment as painful as we do, and even in fact more painful than we do. And yet there is God in the wake of the flood trying again. There is God in the wake of destruction and exile trying again. And there is God in shul year after year, as it were, summoning us to heed the words of the prophet about living lives of decency and goodness and justice and love. On at least one occasion, the Bible hints at something sort of wild. Over time, we come to resemble what we worship. I hasten to add what we really worship, not what we kid ourselves or each other about worshiping. According to Psalm 115, part of the Hallel, for example, those who worship dull and lifeless idols will end up dull and lifeless themselves. Conversely, as some of you have heard me suggest before, worshiping a God who loves widows and orphans means that we will eventually love widows and orphans too. What I want to suggest here, in this context, in this presentation, in this day in America, is that when we worship a God who insists on hope, a God who is so stubbornly relentless that God refuses to ever fully give up hope, then we too will become stubbornly relentless in insisting upon hope. Maybe that is the most positive side of being an Am Kshei Oref, a stubborn, stiff-necked people. We are a people who, like the God we strive to worship, never give up. And finally, one last image from the Bible. I have long been preoccupied with and puzzled by the way the Torah ends. As we read the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, we hear a great deal about the Exodus from Egypt and the long journey through the wilderness towards the land of Israel. We learn in great detail about what is supposed to happen when the Israelites arrive in the land. But then, as the people stand on the precipice of arrival, the story simply ends. The impression, the experience we get as readers is that the story has been cut off mid-sentence. And the question is why? And fascinatingly, the Pesach Haggadah consciously mimics the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Exodus, as you know, speaks of God's 5 promises to the people, at least one, the last one of which being Veheveti, and I, God, will bring you to the land. But that one never gets mentioned at the Seder. In commemoration of 5 divine promises, we drink 4 cups of wine. As at the Seder, as in the Torah, we journey somewhere, but never quite make it. So how should we interpret these texts? This question has bothered me for so long that in 2 of my books, I have offered 2 completely different interpretations. In the Heart of Torah, I suggested that the Torah seeks to teach us that often in life, the journey is at least as important as the destination. The festival of Sukkot, after all, which commemorates not a singular event, but simply a journey, that's the festival we call Zman Simchatenu, the time of our deepest joy. It is the journey that is our delight. Traveling somewhere can be no less holy than getting there. In my more recent book, Judaism is About Love, I offered a different reading that I think is closer to the pshat, to the plain sense. In leaving out the conclusion of the journey, the long-awaited arrival, the Torah wants to teach us that living with faith often requires us to live in a long and often painful, arduous period of not yet. We have a hope and a promise that sustain us, but it is sometimes often excruciatingly far from fulfillment. The waiting can be difficult, devastating, but if we wish to live in faith, then sometimes at least, we need to learn to wait. Now tonight, in thinking about hope, I want to notice the other side of this that suddenly dawned on me the other day. As I've just suggested, the fact that the story is incomplete can be difficult and even agonizing. But the fact that the story is incomplete means something else too, that the future remains open and undetermined. The end of our story remains always yet to be written. In other words, rather than always seeing Deuteronomy ending before we get there as a source of disappointment and heartbreak, perhaps sometimes we can understand it as an invitation to possibility. We may have great anxiety about the future of America and the future of Israel. We may even understandably have great anxiety about the future of civilization itself. But difficult as it may sometimes be to remember this, difficult as it may be to believe it, the future of America, the future of Israel, the future of civilization itself remains open and yet to be written. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Shai. That was a lot to take in. The distinction between hope and optimism is, I'm going to say worth the price of admission, but it's just really, really important. You articulated it beautifully. Just last night, I was watching a documentary about the late filmmaker Paddy Chayefsky, who often had a very dark and cynical view of the world. He was asked, he said, people ask me if I have any hope at all. I tell them I do. I tell them I hope I'm wrong, which I think is kind of gets at an aspect of what we're talking about. But I want to ask a question for someone who wrote the book Judaism is About Love. I think we know that love, it's a mitzvah to love, right? It's a commandment to love your God, which I think in your book says spills over into loving your fellow people. Is it a commandment to hope? Is there something in the sauce that says you're doing it wrong if you allow yourself to succumb to despair? Is it more than advice, but actually an imperative?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. So what I would say is there are inklings of an imperative to hope in Jewish sources, but I want to underscore before I kind of flesh out what I mean by that. But again, I don't think hope is a substitute for grief and pain. It is after we look reality in the face that hope emerges. It is not instead of looking reality in the face. This is something for those interested in this kind of scholarship. The Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann, who died just a few weeks ago, wrote a great deal about this. He talks about how in the prophetic tradition, there are these three modes: reality, grief, and hope. Reality is being honest about how dark things can get. Grief is feeling the pain. And hope is then understanding that grief doesn't get the last word. So I think that that's actually important. And I find that actually just very helpful. Forget about Tanakh for a minute. I find that helpful in just thinking about like making my way through the world. Sometimes I find it helpful in reading the morning newspaper. In terms of inklings in the tradition, we are now in the month of Elul, in which we recite Psalm 27, which ends with a challenge, Kaveh Hashem, hope for God, wait in God. Hard to know exactly how to translate kavah in biblical Hebrew. And then the fascinating notion, Kaveh Hashem, hope in God, chazak v'yametz libecha, that will strengthen your heart, v'kaveh Hashem, and then go on hoping more. The text does not end with the resolution of hope, but with the intensification of it. And I would even say, actually, Andy, to your question, that the very notion of teshuvah is based on and depends on a kind of commitment to hope. It is about a commitment to the idea that the way I am is not the final destination for my life story, right? Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Katz, the great Hasidic Rebbe, one of the kind of themes that he comes back to again and again in his teachings is a person is forbidden to think of themselves as a finished product. There's no such thing as a person who's a finished product. If you think you're a finished product, you're dead, right? And I think that that's true about society and about history as well. America is not a finished product. America is always a possibility. Israel is not a finished product. Israel is a possibility. I think it's very important to be open to seeing and experiencing the world that way. But again, it can be very, very painful because real hope, I think, requires with sitting with the depths of our disappointment with the status quo.
There's a theme to some of the questions in the chat, which is, I think, exhaustion, I think is the only way to talk about it. Like maybe the first two times I was called on to really hope, I was willing to, but now that we're seeing it again and again, and I guess you have the great good luck to live a long life, you see the cyclical pattern. What's a way of thinking about these cycles that isn't just like, Gamze Yavor, this too shall pass, which is both hopeful and also despairing. How do you get out of that sense of exhaustion over the repetitive nature of Jewish history, really?
So yeah, I mean, if I had the definitive answer to that question, I and everyone here by extension could, sleep a little easier at night. But here's a couple of things I might say about this. One is that I think one of the great comforts of disappointment and even of despair is that we need not always bear it alone. Is that there is the possibility of solidarity with other people who are experiencing the world in similar ways. And when hopelessness becomes unbearable is when it is coupled with impossible loneliness. And so I think trying to mitigate our loneliness is a really important way of taking a little bit of the edge of hopelessness off. Now, I'll even for a minute, if I could, Andy, just venture into sort of political theory for a minute, because I find this humanly quite moving. So one of the things that political theorists who write about hope talk about is that hope lives at a strange nexus of power and powerlessness. On the one hand, I have to believe in my own agency, my ability to impact the world. On the other hand, in order for something to be hope, it's something that I can't effectuate all by myself. Otherwise, I would just effectuate it, right? I don't hope for things that I could just do, right? I don't hope I'm going to pick up this pencil. I just do it. So on the one hand, hope requires some sense of agency. And on the other hand, hope acknowledges limits to my power. Here comes the interesting part that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I'm not, I'm definitely not a political theorist, but this idea strikes me like as very powerful. The argument is that the way democracy works when it works well is that people who all are aware of the limits of their power come together and pool their power and create what European philosophers call pouvoir en commun, shared power. That what democratic movements are is, I have a little bit of agency, but not enough. You have a little bit of agency, but not enough. You have a little bit of agency and not enough. And we come together. One of the challenges to actually finding the energy to do that, as you rightly said, is exhaustion. And that's again where I would go back to, we need community and family and mitigating loneliness. It's a bit of a roundabout response, but I think that is ultimately the answer, or an answer.
And that notion, the political notion you just mentioned, I think another aspect of exhaustion is a sense of futility. What can I do? I'm one person. All my actions are a drop in the ocean. Um, so, and I guess you partially answered that in saying that, but when we come together, those drops, can fill a bucket, I guess. But
Yeah.
is there a certain Jewish wisdom about the one person versus the many?
So I want to add sort of the other pole to what I just said in light of what you kind of rightly raised, which is that I think we should be very cautious as Jews about talking about drops in a bucket, because it makes individual acts of goodness and holiness seem less significant than they are from a Jewish perspective,
Mhm.
right? It's a little bit like saying, well, I'll never solve the problem of mistreatment of children, so the fact that I saved this child was a drop in the bucket. But that's totally the wrong way to think about it. The fact that I saved this child was, to use good rabbinic idiom, an entire world that was saved, an image of God that was valued. So I really want to urge people as much as possible not to succumb to the idea, I can't fix everything. Yeah, but you can fix something. I have a vague recollection as I'm saying this. This is a long time ago, that I once saw a college student ask Elie Wiesel, what do I do? The world is so broken, like it's just overwhelming. And he said, in my recollection, something like, you don't have to fix the world, fix a corner of it. If you try to fix the world, you will actually despair very fast. But what about one corner of it? Um, I had a conversation recently that really affected me very deeply. And I'm aware that people on this call may have different political perspectives, and I actually would encourage you not to get distracted by that and actually just to hear what this person was saying. I was sitting with an evangelical Christian in Texas, um, who said to me, I want you to know I spend all of my time when I'm not at work, all of it, visiting immigrant families and providing them with food and helping them secure their homes. And I wanted to share with you why I do that. And it's because if people who follow Jesus Christ persecute immigrants, and my understanding of Christianity is that I'm required to do the opposite, then my mission in life is just to protect as many immigrant families as I can. Now, many things moved me about that, but one of them was the fact that he had no illusions of grandeur. He wasn't solving the problem of global xenophobia. He was protecting a few families in Bernie, Texas. That's not a drop in the bucket. That's an act of profound holiness that reverberates in the whole universe. I think as Jews, we have to believe that. If there's some secularized version of that, I'm happy to hear it. But right, there's just something, want to avoid thinking that only the big picture ultimately matters. It matters, and it matters a lot. but a whole lot of little pictures matter too. And ultimately, of course, big pictures are made out of little pictures.
Mhm. You raised a pastor. I know you're very generous in all your books, and especially in Judaism is about love. In learning from non-Jewish sources, Christian sources, is there an insight from a Christian theologian or an activist like you just talked about that Judaism can learn from when it comes to hope and fighting despair? Are there others you often turn to because they get something that we could learn from?
Well, so I cited Walter Brueggemann before. Brueggemann had a
Yes,
complicated relationship with Judaism and over time a very
yes,
hostile relationship with Israel. Um, but his work on hope in the Bible, I have found to be both really beautiful and also honestly personally sustaining. I would say it is a short book, which I don't remember vividly. I always hesitate to recommend books I don't remember vividly, but I think it's called Reality, Grief, Hope, which is his kind of understanding of what it means to discover hope after rather than instead of grief. That I have found really helpful. Um, not not writing as a Christian, but in fact a devout Christian. Terry Eagleton has a book called Hope is Not Optimism. It's not an easy read, but it's a beautiful and inspiring read. Um, I would also say if you look online, I don't remember what it's called, but there is a famous interview with Václav Havel, who also talks about how hope has nothing at all to do with optimism. Hope is a kind of posture I take towards new possibilities emerging. So those are three sources just off the top of my head.
may
Um,
I offer one or two?
Oh, uh,
My name is Mary.
oh, I guess. Oh, sorry, Mary. What you can do is if you can drop them in the chat, that'd be really helpful. And I'll do that now with some of the books Shai had just mentioned. I'm doing that too. So yeah, if you could do that, that would be great. And thank you for your contribution. Um, Someone recommends just, and maybe you can talk about this, Shai, which is your piece on mitigating darkness is something I reread every year. Others on
mm,
this call might appreciate it, and they include a link. Lighting darkness, um,
yeah,
our souls.
yeah,
Ooh.
that's interesting. So sorry, and did I interrupt you?
No, no, no. Go ahead. I just want to see
Oh,
if you wanted anything you wanted to add about that essay.
yeah, just to sort of give people a sense of what this person is referring to, and thank you for remembering that essay I wrote a long time ago. Um, there's a beautiful comment that the Hasidic master, the Sfat Emet, makes, the Sfas Emes, as he would have called himself, um, when God tells Abraham that um, his descendants will be like the stars. That is a numeric claim. It is a claim about quantity. But the Sfas Emes beautifully says, no, it's a claim about quality. Abraham's children will be those who bring little bits of light into the darkest places in the world. That's what stars do. I find that to be just so beautiful and touching and hope filled, and challenging. I mean, sometimes I ask myself, what are the dark places that I've had the courage to venture into, and what have I done there? Um, but that's a very powerful, powerful image. I think that is it's he I think I shared it in an essay on Hanukkah for obvious reasons. Um, but I think it's a kind of universal understanding of a core covenant image about what it means to be a Jew. A Jew is one who is a star in the nighttime sky.
Hmm. We talked earlier about the what can be despairing or hopeful, depending how you look at it, the cyclical nature of history, really. Someone asks, quoting the British philosopher John Gray, suggests that
Mm,
the idea of human ethical progress is a myth. Technical progress, yes, but not ethical. I guess the question there is, well, do you agree? And two, do you think we're the arc of the universe bends towards progress, and is that something we can hold on to?
Yeah. So, you know, John Gray is a really provocative writer and really a cynic. I mean, has really disdain for the idea that human beings are capable of making real moral progress in any way. I I think that that is an important um, voice to incorporate in our thinking. But I think that, in fact, human beings have made moral progress in the ways that the dignity of women and people of color have evolved. We have a long way to go, but it's hard for me to think that we've made no progress in the last 100 years on some pretty central moral issues. Now, the problem is that with progress comes a kind of, what is the right way to put it? Um, a pendulum swinging back very hard, and people who want to push, for a kind of regress. But I do believe in moral progress. I just believe in not being Pollyannish about moral progress. I have some doubts about that famous quote about the arc of the universe bending, because I think the arc of the universe needs to be bent by us. The idea that the arc of the universe somehow bends assumes either a notion of teleology or divine providence, neither of which quite resonate with me at this stage of my life. I'd rather say the arc of the universe can be bent towards justice if we will it, than to say that the arc of the universe bends towards justice.
And that gets to the
In other
notion
words,
of, yeah, I guess
no,
to
I
the,
just I want to place more responsibility on us than
right,
that kind of language seems to imply, or could be taken to imply.
right. I was going to say that leads me to the notion of mitzvah. I think you said a virtue requires action. And I wonder if there's a sense that Judaism is about, you just don't, they're not commanding you to believe in optimism, believe in hope, but actually do stuff. Like do the
Yeah,
stuff.
I mean, what hope actually is such an interesting question. Is it an action? Is it a feeling? Is it a thought? And you know, for those folks who have heard me talk about love, I am inclined to say something similar about hope, as I often say about love, that hope is an existential posture. It's a way of orienting ourselves in the world. It involves the way we feel, the way we think, the way we act, what we will, right? It's all of hope is like a way of holding myself. Or maybe I should say, this might be helpful for some people. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between hope and hopes. Hopes are like specific things with an object. I hope the Yankees no longer use Anthony Volpe as their shortstop. That's a concrete hope, right? Now, but or it's something less stupid than that, right? I hope that John Doe wins his race for Congress because I think he'll do really good things. Those are hopes. Hope, though, is what I'm talking about, is a posture, right? It's an orientation to the world that's more general. And one of the things I think you can say is that in order to have meaningful hopes, you have to have a baseline hope. I hope that that's not totally obscure what I'm saying. We need a fundamental basal hope in order for concrete hopes to be possible. I can hope that America will get better because I have hope about humanity and history and the world. That kind of thing. I'm not totally sure that individual hopes are sustainable without a more baseline orientation towards hope.
What about the kind of someone's asking a question just now, and I think it's basically the fake it till you make it kind of question. Is there
Right.
a sort of benefit in like I'm not feeling it, but I guess I'm going to continue pushing on as if I do, and maybe that'll come to me. Is that even a Jewish notion? The idea that
Yeah. So it's interesting. So in Western thinking, this all goes back to Aristotle, who taught the value of habituation. In the medieval world, a whole range of medieval Jewish thinkers basically were like, oh yeah, Aristotle articulates something here that we think underlies biblical and rabbinic tradition. And lo and behold, the Rambam, Maimonides, talks about hergel, the Hebrew word for habituation, right? So the idea is that I train myself and I change who I am. We use in a cliche way the phrase second nature, but that's what second nature is. Second nature is the nature that I have acquired through practice. My nature may be despairing and dark, but my second nature may be more hopeful. My nature may be brooding and selfish. My second nature may be compassionate. Now, then there's a lot of debate and discussion about what does that practice consist of? I don't think it's just fake it until you make it. I think it's act and bring consciousness. I am really hoping that my heart opens to this through acting like I hope that acting like I feel it enables me to feel it too. Right? Habituation involves both action and a transformation of one's inner world. This is something that Musar writers talk about very beautifully. The medieval idea in a book called Sefer HaChinuch, that the heart follows the deed. And modern Musar writers step in and say, right, but you have to want your heart to follow the deed. Otherwise, you just keep doing the deed over and over again and nothing happens internally. There's a kind of openness you have to bring to the project. I don't think acting hopeful brings you hope. Acting hopeful and wanting your heart to open can bring you hope, right? There's a kind of like mindfulness, attention to it, attention that you have to bring to it. I hope that that's clear.
No, I think so, sure. Someone used the famous Na'aseh v'nishma, no more than one, two rabbis actually.
Yes, I mean, I think that is right, but the Na'aseh v'nishma, meaning we will do and thereby we will hear. But I think that Musar clarification is still helpful. It's not just doing and then automatically hearing. It's doing with a yearning for the hearing to emerge.
Okay, yeah, I see the distinction. I don't want this to end. I mean, it's been a hopeful discussion. Don't get me wrong. I mean, even though we're talking about despair, but it's been hopeful. But I want to end on a positive note, I guess. So the first thing I want to ask is, do we have permission? And I'm not asking you as Rabbi Shai, but does tradition lend us permission to sometimes put aside the headlines and the despair and just kind of let go? That's the first question. The second question is, when you want to do just that, what do you do?
Well, so I think tradition gives us permission to do both things. And I would want to answer it in a funny way. There is Tisha B'Av and there's Shabbos. Tisha B'Av is, you want to grieve, cry your eyes out. Shabbat is, you don't believe in redemption, try living in it right now. Try the experiment of, as it were, pretending that the world is already perfect. Revel in your family or your community or your friends or the company you keep for yourself. Meaning, I think the answer is yes. I don't think there is any feeling or posture that we are required to have at every minute. And in fact, I think the tradition makes a lot of space for the range of human emotional responses, right? So to say that in one more way, Tisha B'Av says, you can't access hope right now. You want to feel grief? Dwell in it. And then Shabbat says, oh, you have trouble like with the brokenness of the world. You just can't take it sometimes. Here's an invitation to a different reality that you can inhabit for one day a week. You have to go back, right? Most of the time is not Tisha B'Av, and most of the time is not Shabbat. But we do have both of those things.
And I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. And like, I hope there are more Shabbats than Tisha B'Avs in our future.
Thankfully, there are in even the way Judaism constructs our calendar. So.
And with that, I want to thank again our partners in this, My Jewish Learning, UJA-Federation of New York, my partners Thea Wieseltier and Beryl Bessemer, and you, Shai. Really, thanks for the insights. And
thank
I
you
guess
so
I could
much,
say
Andy.
Shabbat Shalom. We're close enough.
Yeah. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for taking part in this series, and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you so much.
Blessings, everybody. Blessings.